Oi, gente! Sejam bem-vindos à primeira mesa do último dia do Relampeio. Que bom que vocês estão aqui, acordaram cedo para assistir a gente. Eu sou a Deborah Happ, eu não acordei cedo, eu estou falando aqui da Alemanha, são 3 horas da tarde aqui, está um dia maravilhoso, para deixar vocês com inveja, que estamos morrendo de frio em São Paulo ou no resto do Brasil. Para quem chegou agora, o Relampeio é um festival internacional literário relâmpago, que une autores de vários lugares do mundo, de fantasia, ficção científica e horror, em debates ao vivo e gratuitos pelo YouTube, onde vocês devem estar assistindo a gente agora. Ou se você estiver no Facebook, obrigada por assistir no Facebook também. Se você não já fez isso, por favor, se inscreva no nosso canal, siga nas redes sociais e apoie o Relampeio para a gente continuar nos próximos anos. Esse ano a gente está fazendo um montão de sorteios de livros, livro em Kindle, livro físico, nas nossas redes sociais, então esse é mais um motivo para seguir a gente distribui muitos livros, entram lá e façam parte dos nossos sorteios. E esse ano, que é a nossa terceira edição do Relampeio, a gente está crescendo cada vez mais, e a gente tem o apoio da Editora Aleph, e parceria com a Editora Nua, Editora Escambau, a Banderola, a Agência Mag, o Catarse, o Fantástico Guia, a Mafagafo e a Eita Magazine. A gente também está com uma parceria especial com a Jornada de Literatura Fantástica, da Editora Suma. Olha que chique! E ela começou na semana passada e continua até dia 23. Então, se inscreve no canal deles também e acompanha tudo que eles estão falando, que está bem legal. Tem muita gente legal, nossos amigos, e vai ser bem bacana. Hoje, quem está na transcrição do chat é o JP Lima, desculpa, e a Jana Bianchi. E nos bastidores está o Danilo, que é maravilhoso e está arrumando todos os bastidores pra gente. Então, obrigada por tudo. Hoje, infelizmente, a gente não tem libras, porque todas as mesas são em inglês e a gente, né? Então, é mais um motivo para vocês apoiarem a gente, pra gente ter libras em todas as mesas nos próximos anos. E é isso. Agora eu vou mudar para o inglês e apresentar todo mundo que está com a gente. So, welcome everybody. Today is our first day, our last day of Relampeio, the international literary festival that brings together international authors of horror, fantasy, and science fiction. And I'm very nervous, but I will be better in a few minutes. Here in live and free debates on YouTube. Please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and support us so that we can keep going. Danilo, where's everybody? Anyway, I'm here with Chinelo Onwualu and Jorge Amaral. Sadly, Henrique André couldn't be here with us today. He had a personal problem and couldn't be here. So our theme for today is Futurecasting and the climate crisis. And our translators for this panel are JP Lima and Jana Bianchi. And in the backstage is Danilo. So before we start, I'm going to describe myself, and I'll ask you to do the same. So I am Deborah Happ. I am a very white woman. I have blonde hair that is short, close to my chin. I'm wearing glasses, a gray shirt. It is a Star Wars shirt, but you can't really see it, and I put it on especially for today. And I am wearing purple lipstick. So go ahead. You can start, Chinelo.
I am Chinelo Onwualu. I am a Black woman with hair in locks, long hair in locks. I'm wearing glasses, shiny dangly earrings, and a necklace. I am also wearing purple lipstick. Must be the day for it. And a patterned shirt with black and white flowers all over it.
Hello, people. Nice to be here. Thank you a lot. Well, I am a white man. I have dark brown hair, short hair, and I'm wearing glasses, and I have this kind of blue and green jacket and a gray shirt underneath it. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, so I have some questions for you guys, but if whoever's watching us wants to send us a question, if you can put it written pergunta before, that would be great, and then I can pass them forward. So first things first, what is futurecasting anyway? And what is its relationship to other types of science fiction, like solar punk or Afrofuturism and weird and other things? You can. Who wants to go first? You can choose. I'll let Chinelo because you look like you want to talk.
I always look like I want to talk.
Oh, great.
I think for me, futurecasting is sort of looking at the trends of today, as well as the trends of the past, and using it to make an educated guess about how the world might be often 10, 15, 20 years from now. Futurecasting doesn't tend to look too far into the future because there's too many variables oftentimes. What often is what it's often used for is to try, especially with governments, to try and figure out what kind of threats might be coming down, what kinds of issues we might need to position ourselves to deal with in the future. With writers, I think that futurecasting tends to be something a little bit more creative. For us, we use it as a way of asking ourselves, what if? What if the world continues on the exact same track that it's going now? No changes. What sort of things can we expect? Or more interestingly, what if this thing that we're not paying attention to becomes something that is incredibly important? I think a great example of this is sort of William Gibson's futurecasting the internet in a way, and thinking about economies and what they would look like if they were oriented around information as opposed to other kinds of materials. And so it can be a way for us to try and think about what's going to happen and what should we be thinking about preparing ourselves for in the future. At least that's what I think of it as.
What do you think, João?
Well, for me, I think Chinelo said already kind of what it is, but it's like trying to predict the future, but not imagining it, as she said, but trying to have some logic, trying to know how one thing goes after another and after another, and try to imagine, to predict how it would be in 10 or 15 or 20 years. And in terms of technology, culture, society, nature, and it's very useful to governments, companies, and for example, we can talk about the IPCC climate reports that do this kind of thing. So they tell us how will be the world if you have 1 degree of global warming or 2 degrees of global warming, and what will happen? We'll have the ocean going up that much, how much? What will happen to societies in coastal cities, for example? What will happen to a species? Everything that can happen if some specific kinds of stuff happens with the climate, and what happens if we do not do anything about it, or if we try to change things, change the way we live, and avoid some stuff. So this is kind of a prediction, but based on scientific evidence and stuff like this. And writers usually go further from that and try to imagine things, even if we don't have yet some real characteristics or material. And I think regarding the genres that you asked, I think each one of those genres try to bring some aspects of reality that is specific for each one of them. So if you are trying to write a new weird, for example, you try to mix everything, species and human, and imagine a future where everything is more mixed and strange. If you are trying to write something that is solar punk, for example, you will imagine a green planet and better stuff and some kind of life that is better than now. So it depends on the kind of genre that you are writing. And I think the reader also will expect some kind of different stuff in each kind of genre that you are reading. So each author will try to answer some questions based on what each writer imagine of the future and what each genre tropes and conventions try to tell us about the future.
Nice. We usually understand that science fiction, as well as fantasy and horror, uses the imagination to talk about the present day and our problems that we have now. So do you think that through futurecasting, it helps us to think about issues that could occur in the future, but do they talk about what we have now as well? And how does it do that?
So I think futurecasting is impossible if you don't look at what's happening right now. So the thing about people often think that when writers write about like future things that are going to happen, it's pure imagination, and they're, oh, how could you think of? But very often what we are doing is we're really observing what we're seeing right now, and we're thinking, okay, where does this go? And because we are often looking at much more broader criteria, I think George was really, really accurate in using the IPCC reports, but they tend to look at, like, let's say, very, very narrow criteria, like, okay, what does it look like if temperatures rise 1 degree? But then they look at things like, weather patterns. But writers are often looking at like social trends. We're looking at, what do families look like? What do human relationships look like when things like this happen? And that allows us to sort of go in wilder directions, I think. And I think that if we're not really paying attention to what's actually happening right now in the world, what sometimes can happen is we write wish fulfillment, where we write these things that, like, this is what I would love for the world to look like, but it has no basis in reality. And very often, sometimes you can spot that. For instance, one of the things that I always find interesting when I read future casting from like the 50s or the 60s is that they imagine these wonderful technologies, like what would happen if we colonize Mars, but they can't seem to imagine what it would look like if men and women related to each other differently, or what would it look like if the racial strata of a society change. And you can always spot the era in which a thing is written when the writer doesn't necessarily take into account all the ways that things can change. One of the things I find interesting about some of the dystopian future casting that we see today in a lot of the media that's coming out is that it often imagines a future in which our civilization, our capitalist system, is the only thing that's keeping us together. Like, it's the only thing that's keeping us civilized, and if we lose the ability to go out and buy ridiculous amounts of things all the time, somehow society will devolve back into the caveman ages, and women will be forced to. There's a lot. I think a great example of this to me is The Walking Dead, where you have a zombie apocalypse, but it seems like it makes everybody behave in the absolute worst ways they could possibly behave. When the truth is, if you actually look at what happens in societies when they experience catastrophic failure, it's not often, it doesn't often go that way. There are actually, different ways that things happen. And there's often like an order that kind of comes together. A great book to read about this sort of thing is Rebecca Solnit's Paradise Built in Hell. And she looks at the actual ways that societies come together in the face of catastrophic failures, like Hurricane Katrina in the United States, and I think that that's really interesting, because that tells me that she and writers like her are being really being observant about the world and about how the world actually works. So I can put there's a link already. So yeah, I think future casting depends on having a really clear understanding of what is actually happening today, but not just in one small area, but sort of broadly and across a lot of different fronts.
Well, I was thinking about your speech. So we are doing the best that we can because we are in capitalist society. So this is very sad. If this is the best that we can do, so it's well, I guess in trying to foretell what's going to happen in the future, we are essentially trying to know how to live the present, I guess, and open our eyes to some structures of society or worldviews or cultural, social behaviors that could lead to certain kinds of futures that we may or may not want to happen. I mean, we might not be able to notice, for example, that the idea of progress or of capitalism, of many things that are happening now, we may not be able to see alternatives to those kinds of stuff. So when we try to imagine different futures, we are trying to imagine different presents also. And this is for everything. So political programs, climate change, and social behavior, like Chinelo said about men and women, and kinds of jobs, work relations. So science fiction can show us with those speculative figurations, speculative futures, trying to foretell the problems that we'll face, and trying to imagine solutions that may or may not exist yet, for these problems that may or may not happen also. And this is necessary, I think, to show us what to do now, show us what to do from now on. So what do we want to happen? Do we want to have the global warming go worse than it is now? So it's very cold here now in São Paulo. In Germany, it's very hot. I don't know how it's there in Chinelo's place, but
Hot, very hot.
Very hot. Yeah. Not normal. It's already happening. So we have to think about it now, so we can avoid that the next generation suffer those consequences. So I think the science fiction can help us notice those kind of things that sometimes is naturalized. Sometimes we live in an autonomous way of, well, this is it. Capitalism is the only alternative. Buying iPhones every year is the only alternative. and destroying the Amazon, the forest, destroying everything so we can have more products, have more plantations. If we don't think about it, we will just do everything as we have been doing for 500 years now. So we will go to those Walking Dead futures anyway. We will not think about it, we just do it. Yeah. So we have to have those kind of thinking about it. I have to. The books do this. So this is how we think about the present by studying and predicting the future, I think.
So just to be clear, so futurecasting, it's not necessarily a gender, it's just a type, a mechanism we use to write science fiction, right?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Okay.
I think I would definitely say so. Yeah.
Nice.
It's a mechanism. It's used by a lot of different people, but yeah, we also employ it to do what we do. And not just science fiction. You know, future casting can also, we use it for like horror and sometimes for fantasy. You know, when you're looking at like world building, it's important. I think future casting is especially important when you're trying to build realistic or believable worlds. Yeah.
Yeah. You can think that if it's very near a near future, it could be a forecast. Futurecast maybe 10 years from now. So you can use this for economics. We can try to predict what will be the next economic crisis in 10 years. So it's not fiction. So it's,
yeah, I think a great example of this is Ministry of the Future by what's his name?
Robinson, Kim Stanley.
Yeah. Kim Stanley Robinson. He writes this book that sort of it's kind of a Bible of what could happen in the next, I think, 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
If trends like, you know, cryptocurrency become, you know, bigger, if climate change becomes worse, it's not a story per se, more than it is just like here's what could happen, read it. So it's I think a very, very good example. A lot of his work is actually a really good example of future casting.
Yeah, he tries to think about every aspect of reality: economic, climate, social. So he's doing an experiment of future casting in his books, and that's it. This is the difference. I think you can have it for reality, for companies and government, and we can have it in fiction. So, and in fiction we can go further and imagine 1,000 years from now what it will happen, but then we lose the logic of what happens after this. For example, we have this crisis of economics and climate now. What happens in 5 years? Well, we can imagine that in 5 years we have this kind of situation. Well, with these problems, how we will face it? What kind of solutions we will try to achieve to solve this in 5 years? Well, then after those solutions, what problems we will have in 10 years? And then we will have new forms of solutions, and go on and on, and 5, 10, 15. This is it.
So, especially about climate change, then we'll talk about that because it is the title. How do you think that speculative fiction can help us cope with these desperate times? And do you think there's a way of thinking about climate change in a positive way, maybe? And maybe fiction can help us with that.
I think fiction is maybe the only thing that can really help us with that. I don't want to I don't want to make our, make it seem like we are going to say but honestly, I think that before you can make a thing, you have to imagine it. And what our societies need creatives for is that source of what I call generative imagination, the kind of imagination that inspires real world people to then go do things. An excellent example of this is the Star Trek series. When the original series came out, it imagined a world where there was racial equity, gender equity, equity between, Cold War, societies that were on the brink of war at the time. And imagine this unified humanity going out into space to explore and meet. And it did these, it also imagined economies that weren't capitalist, right? And that really blew people's minds. Even the technologies that were only, imagined on the show have spawned so many real life things. I think Steve Jobs often thanks the show for the idea for the iPhone, because it showed these little handheld devices that we could press things on, and so that is an amazing example of this kind of positive imaginative representation of what our future could be. I think that for those of us who are creatives, who are imagining ways to get through the climate crisis, there are a lot of ways that we can think of how bad it's going to get if we don't change things. I think we are at a point where that is pervasive everywhere you look. But what can sometimes happen is that it can breed a sense, at least to me, of fear. But fear is not a place from which you can imagine, from which you can effectively imagine. Fear closes you off. I think, George, you were mentioning my speech, and this was kind of the I gave a keynote address at the University of Uppsala's Co-Futures conference. And what I was really talking about was a sense that we need a sense of radical optimism, a sense of optimism in the face of these enormous odds, not one that is, that is kind of, oh, it's going to be fine. We don't need to do anything, but almost a sense of whatever we do, just do. Whatever we need to try, we just need to try, because we are facing such a huge game changer in the climate crisis that we can't afford to be frozen in place in fear. What fear does, it has us holding on to the things that we know, the things that are familiar, capitalist systems, exploitative labor mechanics that destroy people and ecosystems, because what we want to do is make sure that we can hold on to the tiny little scraps of comfort that we have now. And we are in an era where there's a lot of political forces that are really capitalizing on this fear that people have, and are telling us that if we don't close our borders, if we don't, hoard our resources, these other people will come and take it from us. Look at the world, And so I think that what speculative fiction can do is to imagine a world where everything goes right. Like, I think that is some of the most radical thinking that, creatives can do today, is imagine worlds where things go right. And I'm not necessarily talking about worlds where people are not people anymore. They're just happy, dancing skeletons. But what happens if we actually look at what we are doing and find actual workable solutions? And what could those solutions possibly look like? I was involved in a program it's run by grist.org, and it's called Imagine 2020, 2200 actually. And what it is that it has all these writers come together to envision what a clean and just future could be, but from a specific position in which we are taking into account cultural realities. What does a world look like if it's not run by capitalism? What does the world look like if it takes into account indigenous ways of relating to nature and to each other? And some of those stories, we had one I think last year, and we're doing it again this year. Some of those stories are amazing. It's in the judging process right now, and you know, they're all such radical visions of what could be, while still letting people be people, so there's still jealousy, there's still, people trying to like get their own, people are still being people, but in worlds in which we have imagined that things went right. And I think there's nothing more radical than that right now.
I totally agree. I think even thinking in psychological way, if we are in fear, we will fight or run or entering a negation state. Like we can see here in Brazil, everyone is in negation. So we negate the reality. Yeah. So if we don't want to have fear, we want to have hope for change. So there are a lot of stories and books that only narrate a bad scenario, only narrate the bad stuff that will happen. And this, I think, can make us think a little bit about the future, but doesn't bring us alternatives. We need alternatives for the way that we live today. So we need books, we need stories that enhance the way that we can change how we live in this world now. And if you read, for example, this book by Caroline Merchant, The Death of Nature, there she explains how the way we think about stuff now, the way our science do things and our way of living, this is based on something that happens there back there in 15th century. So with the scientific revolution, the way of thinking capitalism that was starting to rise by there. So we are still thinking in those ways, those complex matrix of thinking. So we need to change that. And for changing that, we don't want to be in fear. We want to be in expectation of something good, something beautiful. So stories that show us how to relate with each other in different ways, different kinds of families, different kinds of kinship, different kinds of relation to nature, different dualism between culture and nature, that we are still seeing nature as something that's separated from us, and we shouldn't do that. And different relations to other species, to animals, to plants. How can we live together with all the stuff that is in Earth, all the living stuff, and all the non-living stuff, like the rocks, the rivers. Like Ailton Krenak used to say that our river is also a living being, is also a parent, is also a grandparent. So we have to maybe look also at those different indigenous or original people's way of living, I think the fiction can bring this kind of different realities to our reality and mix everything. So trying to imagine a future where everything is mixed and we live in different kinds of relations, and be better and be happy, not by avoiding the problems, but by trying to bring new solutions, I guess.
Well, we have a question from the public, which is actually from Daniel, but I think that, hi Daniel, I think that you already answered it, and he asked, but you can go on if you want. Do you think that looking to the past and to societies that were non-capitalist can be a good way to futurecast?
Yeah, actually, that's what I mean. My imagination can only take me so far, and so what I've been doing is I've been looking particularly at pre-colonial societies in West Africa, particularly the ways that my own ethnic group, which is Igbo, might have worked and had their relationships in pre-colonial Nigeria. And what I found are these really surprising connections and ways of being. And I think Ursula K. Le Guin was the one who said that, before monarchies, the divine rights of kings seemed like the only thing that before we could imagine anything beyond that, that seemed like the only way to live. And so I'm very much paraphrasing her, but we are sometimes there is this story of humanity that makes it seem like capitalism and exploitative labor and systems, or even like autocratic or monarchist systems are somehow this like march towards civilization, in which we started as pastoral hunter-gatherers and then moved step by step by step. And that's just not actually how human history works or worked. And it often ignores those societies that don't fit that narrative and just kind of shoves up off to the side and pretends they're not there. A great book about this sort of reimagining and re-understanding of this is The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow. And what it does, it actually looks at the archaeological evidence for how human beings actually live. And it shows us that even what we're unearthing about the ways that people form their communities is so vastly different. There's so many more ways that we related to each other and to nature. And George is right. Like we do need to think about these things very differently. But what gives me hope is that we've done this before. So this isn't something that is coming out of the bright blue sky. We have a long history of relating to, the world and to each other in very, very different ways. When we are left to our own devices, we come together in a dizzying array of configurations. There is a school of thought that wants us to think that the nuclear family is inevitable, that, monogamous, heterosexual, cisgender, family units is the only way that we can be. And even in that, we are showing that that's just not the way people work. We come together in a lot of different ways. We've always thought of gender in a lot of different ways. And so trying to sort of pin us in time or pin us in place can actually cause a shrinking of possibility in the world. Is that my baby? That could be my baby. And so what that happens, what it is that benefits a certain group of people. the people in power want you to believe that they have always been in power, that their power is inevitable. That could be anything from patriarchal power with men, pretending that the history of humanity has always been patriarchal. That's just not true. It can be anything from, kings telling us that the rule of kings is inevitable and has always been so. That's just not true. And so when we can go back and see how things were different, we can start to understand how things could be different as we go forward. And that's incredibly important. And sometimes that's where, our imaginations, and the imaginative class and the imaginative creatives can come in, because we spend a lot of time thinking about this. A lot of time thinking about this. And so the gift that we can bring to the world is this sense that there is so much more to it than we can see. And yeah, and that's kind of what makes me excited about writing in the climate future and climate casting, space, because there is so much more possibility than we have allowed ourselves to imagine,
Yeah, I think we have to look at history, not only human history, but the planet history, I guess. We have to go beyond our narcissism and see that we are not here for so long, and see that the Earth will go on without us. The planet will go on. So we have to look back and see how things were and how things changed, as Chinelo said. We had kings, we had other kinds of government, other kinds of economics, other kinds of living together. Maybe we have to question also some historical facts. For example, we are used to think that living in cities and in a society is better than living as gatherers and hunters, but not necessarily this is true. Maybe they were happy there. Maybe they were happy going in the fields and get an apple direct from the tree, and not having to live in a place full of disease and full of garbage and full of smoke. Maybe they were happy. There are some authors now that are questioning those kind of strict facts that we used to think as necessary, as if we had to be in society just like it is now. We didn't have to. This is something that happened because of some kind of circumstance, but we could go back if you wanted to. So we have to look at history of humankind, of Earth, of the other species, and see how we can learn from this too, and then think of the future.
That's nice. So pretty. So Yolanda Moreto, hi, she sent us a question as well. That is, how do you think that the impact of the COVID pandemic will be for future casting? Because it's something that was already discussed by scientific communities. So how can it develop further?
I'll let George take this one first.
Oh, okay. Well, I think the pandemic changed the way that we are already living now. So we are doing this event not only because of the pandemics, but this affected the way we do events and how we relate to each other, I think, using technology for that. So I think if we didn't have the pandemic, the forecast, the future cast would be different from what it is now. I think we had to change some kind of predictions after the pandemics. So to imagine societies with more online interaction and even more disease, even other pandemics. So new products were invented during this time, new software, new applications, new medicine. So a pandemic is just like it sometimes happens when we have a war or some kind of disastrous event. We have to change very quickly to adapt to it. So it makes the future casting goes fast. I don't think, it goes faster than it would be if we didn't have the pandemic. I think those kind of Chinelo can go on.
Yeah, I actually I agree 100%. I think pandemics, things like pandemics and other disasters really accelerate, change. I think for many of us, pandemics also showed how fragile our systems were. It didn't take very much to completely disrupt people's lives. I mean, over here we had shortages of food and essential goods, and I think for a lot of people, the pandemic also showed it gave them a lot of time to think about their values and what it is that was important to them. So many of us lost friends and family, and it gave us this sort of weird opportunity to slow down and ask ourselves, why are we doing this? And I think in doing that, some of the answers became quite surprising. So there's been a lot of talk about the Great Resignation, at least in North America, where people have just been quitting their jobs, seeing just how much time and energy and investment these things were asking out of them and not giving them a lot back. And so one of the things I think that has, in some parts of society, it has radicalized certain people into really questioning the why of the systems that they're in. Some parts of society found people, and this was a trend that's been going on for quite some time. People were moving back into their family homes and questioning, the insistence on, a kind of radical independence that isn't always seen in other parts of the world, where people are much more comfortable living in multi-generational families and seeing the benefits of that. And so I think what pandemics in general can do, but what this one did in particular, was show us that there were different ways that we could do things. I remember how many companies told people with disabilities that there's no possibility that you can work from home, that it's just not possible, you can't do it. And then next thing you know, everybody's working from home, which told those people that what the companies were saying is there's no way, wasn't that there was no way, is that we don't want to do this. And so I think for a lot of us, understanding that there's a massive difference between the two, a massive difference between what can be done versus what will be done, and those two things are not always the same. And so I think the pandemic has been very valuable in allowing us to think about that. Some of the fallout has been, the healthcare industry in North America, and how many nurses we lost, how many people burned out and are still burning out. It's also shown in terms of global politics, the capture that capitalist medicine and pharmaceutical industries have had on the world. There was a time when the vaccine would have been distributed, to communities in need, it would have been led by governments and much more equitable. I remember when I was growing up, we got, vaccines for TB and smallpox and measles. And those were provided by non-governmental organizations. We weren't charged for it. I don't know if that could happen today in the same way. And I think that shows us the kind of capture that for-profit medicine has had on our systems, and the ways that many of our governments can no longer kind of stand up to some of these, oligarchic interests, I think. And if nothing else, it's sort of getting more people to see what is there in front of them and to ask questions about why, if nothing else. I don't know where that takes us, good or bad, but at least asking the question why is super important. And I think COVID did that for a lot of people.
Yeah, I thought about something when you were talking about the last thing about looking at non-capitalist societies, and then I forgot, but I'm going to say it now. So a few years ago, I read Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch, and it was so shocking to see what the world was, what Europe was in medieval times, right? So before there was this construction of a capitalist society, but also a very industrial society, and that how different it changed the families, the family structure. And then women were put inside the houses so that the men could work more. And it wasn't like that before. So before, and I don't know, feudal times, that things were more equal. And I had never thought of that, so just looking at old, not scripture, but old manuscripts and how people lived beforehand, that's so interesting. And it was like, I don't know, 200, 300 years ago. It wasn't really a long time ago. So we just, we take for granted how we live now. And it wasn't always like that. So, and that's just something that people tell us, women and men can't be equal because who would work, And I just I moved from São Paulo to Germany recently, and they don't work at all here. I remember in São Paulo, we took an hour to go to work, an hour to come back, and we would work like 44 hours a week. And we had very little vacation. And when we did, it was a big rush because nobody else could do their jobs. And here, like, my wife is working in a small company, and people take time out all the time. And like, she finishes working at 3 p.m. on Fridays, and it's fine. And everybody does that. And so it's just like looking, and everybody takes it for granted here. They're like, oh no, I wish I had more vacation. And we're like, you have no idea what working hard is. So it's funny that just getting out of your own society and looking at how different people live just gives you this big it's big shift of vision. No, that's not the right word. Of imaginary. Which takes me actually to my next question. Since we're all from the global south, you're from Nigeria originally, right, Chinelo? Yeah. So since we're all from the global south, how do you think that shifts our perspective or could help us to think about different outlooks to global issues?
I think for me, one of the big things that I bring into sort of the future casting and the climate talk space is my own history of colonialism and of the exploitation of human chattel slavery. And I bring into that this understanding that one thing, this radical sense that even when the apocalypse happens, we will survive. It may be very different from the ways that we lived before. I look at my own family history around the massive changes in just 3 or 4 generations between my great-grandmother and mine, and the ways that we live and the ways that our society transformed and the landscape of our cities. And it's radical. It's unimaginable. And I bring that history and I bring that consciousness to what I do and what I write, because I think sometimes it can be easy in the global north to think that we will capitalist our way out of this. You know, we'll invent something that everyone can buy and we'll be fine. Or we can, or, you know, or that we will come up with the solutions that everybody else in the world will somehow just take on and everything will be great. But it betrays this, you know, this massive ethnocentrism in which, you know, it continues to perpetuate this idea that the North has all the answers and we'll just hand it out like candy to everybody else. And everybody will just fall in line and it'll be fine. It'll work for everyone. But it's already shown that like so many of the green solutions that we are proposing, like, you know, carbon capture or cap and trade, those things are not particularly useful. And they very often do not continue to rely on the exploitation of resources from the global south. So solar is a very interesting thing for me, because while on the one hand, it is really exciting to think that we can find this source of power that is constantly renewable, that is, you know, free, it's abundant in so many places. But we don't look at the fact that so many of the components for solar, you know, panels are heavy metals mined in places like Central Africa, you know, South America, and that those things, those, you know, those systems, or Central Asia, those systems continue to rely on people being used as things, and that no matter how wonderful it sounds, those are not systems that should be allowed to continue for the benefit of the few. And so when we are thinking about climate solutions or climate, or future casting or the climate itself and how we get out of this, I like to think that coming from Nigeria and having that holistic understanding of systems and historical systems will help. If people listen, right, it will actually help us both stay confident that even as radical change happens, we are still going to find ways to survive, because many of us have. If you ask, Native peoples from all over the world, we do understand what it's like to completely lose your way of life, to completely have everything you know and depend on destroyed, and still find ways to survive and still find ways to thrive. And that could be something that happens on a global scale. And we need to understand that that doesn't mean that we cease to exist. We're still here, and we will still be here. That's the radical confidence that I bring to this, is the fact that we are still here. And if we are careful, and if we try not to remake the same mistakes, we can still do this. We just have to be mindful of everyone's needs. It can't just be a solution for one group of people. There are so many others that we have to think about and take into account. And I think that's what I bring, and that's what my global South perspective brings to this.
Well, that's perfect. I totally agree. I think, as Chinelo said, we live in the South and have lived some unique circumstances, under some unique ways of being exploited and suffering a lot of things. So this experience, this having been living under those circumstances may make us able to address issues of the future in a different way than the North, I guess. So as Chinelo said, the North usually have some solutions that are good for them. So green solutions and capitalist solutions. And here we can address this in a different way. We can think about the apocalypses that already happened, the indigenous people that died, the way that we were colonized, the way that our forests have been destroyed, our lands, our plants, our gold and stones, everything that went to the north was taken from here and went to the north. So every one of those issues, I think the South can translate into something different for the future. So we have the opportunity to address colonial issues, imperialism, patriarchy, slavery, ecocides, the economic dependence. And we can link everything in a way different than in the North they would do. And everything, every aspect of it is related to the climate also, to the climate crisis, to the climate change. So we cannot also talk about the climate change without talking about all this stuff. So we have to mix everything. We have to talk about climate justice, but also about social justice, about equality, about a way that people could live better and in every way, in economics, health. So we also have to talk about the pandemics, have to talk about everything in a way that we are not closing our eyes to some part of it. I guess in the North, they usually talk about the climate, but they close their eyes to the social problems, close their eyes for the colonial problems that still happen. So we can have a way of think about all this stuff in a broad way, I guess. And also, sometimes I hear that we already live in the South in a dystopia. Here in Brazil, we are always saying that. So if we live in a dystopia, we have more urgent necessity of changing things. So we may have more urge to change how we are now than the North. If they are good there, they won't change things. We need to change things.
I agree with that sentiment about dystopias. I always joke that the global north is terrified of becoming the global south today. Yeah. So I see a lot of dystopic things. I'm like, but that's just how that's Nigeria,
Yeah, there are some books that describe something that we already live here. This is São Paulo. This is look at
that's Lagos. Like what?
Yeah.
This is not the future. This is now.
Yeah. This is now.
Yeah, I think that there was I think in the Bild, I'm not sure, in one of these German newspapers, they were talking about the dystopic New York that is São Paulo. And it's like, yeah, that's it. Yeah. So going back to literature, Samuel Mulca. Hi, Mulca. It's so good to see you. See that you're watching us. Do you feel that fiction could have the edge to inspire political solutions for the current disasters and climate emergency?
Yeah.
I think we talked about that before, but just be more in depth. Yeah. Sorry.
Do you want to
go
go, Chinelo? Yeah. Well, yes, as we talked already, the fiction can help us think of solutions, of alternatives, of political new forms of government, of relations, can inspire us to see that it's possible to have different kinds of democracy or something that we don't know yet. And I really think that we can find a different way of government that we don't have yet, we never had. So I think the fiction can show us, oh, well, we could invent something very different that anyone thought about yet. And this is it. This is the new alternative. This is not right or left. This is something new. So I think fiction can bring this kind of imagination and help us think how we could live the future.
I think that actually, I don't know that any radical new way of living hasn't come from some sort of fictional understanding. I mean, if we look at it, if we look at it in a, if we're honest with ourselves, before we can suggest radical change, we have imagined what that looks like for us. One of the things I think that writers can do and do very well is say, okay, this thing that we're thinking of, how far can we take it? Where does it go? What are the unintended consequences for this thing that we are all so excited about? And that can either serve as a warning system or it can serve as an inspiration. But I do believe that even when we're thinking about fascism, that has been inspired by, people writing things down and imagining, what does a fascist world look like? There's a book that I'm not going to, give the name of, but it has become the handbook of the American rights, the American radical rights, in imagining how to go about using terrorist using terrorism to bring about this new world order. And it's terrifying, but it is a work of fiction. And it has led to a lot of inspiration. A lot of people, a lot of groups have taken it on, and they are actively working to bring that world to being. And I think that if we want to counter that, we need to have a narrative that is just as compelling on the other side, a narrative that tells us this is the world we can live in, and it's not radical, it's not far-fetched, it's not beyond us. I think that's often the dismissal that systems of power will tell us, like, oh, this thing you're thinking of is too radical, like it's unrealistic, it's too expensive, it's whatever. But I think that what we need is a vision of the future that is just as radical, as just as inspiring, that is in its own way radically simple. I think that is something that often is used to dismiss ideas, like, oh, it's too complicated, it's too people don't do that, like that's not how people behave. And that often comes from an understanding of this is the way people are, which is just as much a fiction as anything else. The idea that people are innately selfish, people are innately hierarchical, people always want somebody to exploit, people always need an underclass. Those are all fictions that we have come to believe about ourselves and about our world. And I think the thing that the thing that fiction can do for us is to expose those for the lies and the stories that they are, because they have come to represent this kind of truth when they're not true, not in the least.
I think Chinelo said something very important. Fiction is not always good also. Fiction can be bad. So we have to be critical of what we are reading also. The readers have to be critical of it. So we can imagine better futures or worse futures and go for it. So it's dangerous also.
Yeah, no, Elon Musk is a great sci-fi fan.
That's scary.
Yeah. All right. Delil Waitot has another question. I didn't really understand, but I hope you do because you're smarter than me. What do you think about the debate adaptation versus mitigation?
So I think it's a false debate, to be absolutely honest with you. I think that, so the debate around that is people are saying, well, climate change is already here. We need to adapt our systems to roll with it, to kind of to take it into account. Mitigation is like, well, we can still stop it. We can still do things that will allow us to continue living the way we are and just, slow it down. I think pitting those two ideas against each other is a false dichotomy. We have to both adapt to it and continue to work to not make it worse. That's the only way that we can, survive. But I think also what we have to do is really reimagine what it means to survive climate change. I think too many of us are hoping to get out of this with all our systems and institutions intact, with our ways of life completely unchanged. I think that's where so much of the climate anxiety in the global north comes from, is that we are going to lose this thing that we have when, first of all, it's not yours. You stole it. So you might have to give it back and you're going to have to lose it at some point. Maybe there is an understanding that there are other ways that you can live that will still fulfill you, but not look like the way you're living now. Is the way you're living now really the way you want to live? Is this really the best you can do? I think, George, you mentioned that. Is this really the best we can do? If it is, then that's really sad, because there's got to be something better, right? And so I think it's a false debate. And it's one, I think, that divides us and allows the current systems of exploitation to continue unchanged while we all, yell at each other about no this, no this. Do it both. Do it all. Do whatever we need to do, because this is big, and it's not just about losing our cushy lifestyles and disrupting our daily routines. It's more than that.
Yeah, I think Chinelo already answered, but I guess we are not now neither adapting nor mitigating. We are doing nothing. So we have to adapt because it's already happening, and we have to mitigate. We have to try to avoid. And do nothing is not the alternative. So we can be better, as she said. We can do more.
We have another question here by Marcelo Souza. He said that he's loving the debate. Thank you so much. And he'd like us to talk a little bit more, or you talk a little bit more about how do you think technology can help us with possibilities for the future?
So I think the definition of technology has to change. When we think of technology, we think of it in this very narrow understanding of, like, you're going to go in and take a natural resource and turn it into something on a large, usually a large scale, one that inevitably dispossesses somebody and continues a system of ecocide, right? That is not how we've always thought of technology. And if you look at human history, that's not necessarily how we have done things. And so when I think of technology, I think of a great example of technology is the food forests of North America. So people often ask, how did early pre-colonial Americans feed such vast, populations in their cities without having huge fields that they were plowing and burning, and the answer has been something as simple and as radical as all these forests that settlers came in and saw. This is a beautiful land with plentiful fruit trees just growing everywhere in like orderly spaces. God must have done this. No, actually, people did this. People tended these forests, grew them in a way that allowed lots of different kinds of food to grow, to feed populations. And so agriculture is technology, but agriculture can be done in so many more ways than we often think of. We think of agriculture, we've been led to think of agriculture as the plow, as a cow, as as clear cutting, but many different places had many different forms of agriculture, and those were indigenous technologies that were developed in relationship to the lands that they were living in ways that preserved a kind of social balance, because they recognized that they weren't this thing that came in and dominated, that our role was to find a way to live in harmony and balance with all the other creatures and plants and ecosystems that we found ourselves in. And I think that the understanding of technology has kind of lost that and has moved away from it as something that is separate from, above, in charge of, and that's something I think that we need to move away from if we really want to radically change the ways that we relate to the world and find ways to get back to that. That's not to say that it was some kind of utopia, no, but there were different ways of thinking about technology.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we think technology inside those separations between nature and culture. So we think that technology is something that will control and dominate nature, something that there's nothing to do with it, nothing to do with forest or with indigenous thinking, as Chinelo was saying. So we can't think about technology as something divine that will came up someday and restore our perfect capitalism in life. So we can't think about technology as this solution that will someday appear that allows us to continue doing what we do now. Usually people say that there will be some kind of solution. Scientists will invent something to solve the problem. We can't do that. You have to go, as she was saying, go back, go look at the other side, go look at the technologies of the forest, the technologies of the indigenous people. Go look at something that we are trying to destroy. For example, we have the bees that do all those marvelous stuff, growing plants, and we are trying to destroy them and create something artificial.
Robot bees. That's
Robot
what
bees. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we are going to destroy every bees and create robot bees that do the same. Yeah. So this is not technology. This is ignorance. This is some kind of narcissism that we have to control. So the robot bees we control. The nature one, no. So this is a problem.
Yeah.
So this is technology as some form of control, some form of domination of man over nature, I think it's a problem. You have to adapt. You have to put everything together and understand the technologies of the nature and maybe live in a way that we can use it and be okay with it, be in harmony with the technologies that already exist and create new ones that will prevent, that will destroy everything.
There's an interesting question I think Yolanda Moreto asked in the chat about what is the greatest difficulty in creating stories that serve as a warning but also bring hopeful possibilities to the audience. And I was like,
I didn't see that one.
That's a good one. As well as like how difficult is it to imagine the problems of a future society? I think I'd love to hear what George has to say about that, actually.
So I didn't see the question, but...
Oh yeah, I passed you that one. Thanks for getting it up.
Well, it's how to show the problems, right? How we can show all the bad stuff that's happening and that will happen and still have hope. I guess this is the question. I don't think it's so difficult. I think we can address all those things that we are talking here and still, in a way, bring some kind of solutions, bring some kind of imagination for creating new ways of life, change. I always think that the solution is not in technology or some kind of thing, some kind of physical thing that we should create, but in changing our minds, in changing our mindset. So I guess even if the world is worse in some years, in, I don't know, 10 years, maybe if we have changed the way that we think, maybe we can live better than now, even in a worse place, I guess. We can have better relations, better work, better emotions, I guess. Better, we can be happy even in a worse place if we change our mindset, I guess. So maybe this is a way, I don't know, of showing both things. What do you think, Chinelo?
For me, it has been incredibly difficult to stay hopeful while thinking about things, because one of the major difficulties that I came across was, what does a world look like without hierarchy? Like, one of the things capitalism tells us is that people, you have to have people who have more than other people, and those people, whether they tell us that it's because they deserve it because they worked harder, or because they deserve it because they are a better race, or they, a lot of different stories about why those people have more than other people. And so for me, the difficulty has always been, if we eliminate systematic this inequalities, can people still be people? And I think that they can. I think the problems of a future society are often because people are still people, and we're still petty, we're still jealous, we're still we are still, we'll still have personal traumas that we'll be going through and dealing with and inflicting that on each other. I think no matter how perfect the society is, we're still going to be people. And I think that for me, the difficulty has been breaking out of the boxes that capitalism has put me in, because capitalism, white supremacy, hierarchical thinking that assumes that history is the more getting to do bad things to the less. That has been the most difficult thing for me to unravel in my own head and in my own writing. And I think that anyone who takes future casting, who takes it very seriously, we have to be aware of our own biases, and we have to be aware of the preconceptions that we have been taught before we can start to really truly break out of it. I think sometimes that's why dystopia is easier, because it allows us to focus on our pet things, like, okay, I want to talk about women's rights, so I'm going to show you how bad it can be by pulling from all the ways that bad things that happen to women. But what it does is then it kind of inures the audience to seeing bad things happen to women, and they're like, yeah, man, that sucks, but we're not that bad now, so we don't really have to change anything. And so I think some of the challenges can be in really addressing our own biases as writers and as creatives, and really taking an unflinching look at the ways that we have allowed these things to sort of sit in our own subconscious and our own brains. It's a hard thing, because we're people, even when we are trying to create these solutions and present these ideas, we're still people, and we're still mired in our own messes. And sometimes when we're called out on it, we can get very defensive. Well, I was trying to do a good thing. Can't you at least, give me that? But I think that is the challenge for us as we try to reimagine the world, is what is standing in our own way. And I think before we can effectively tell other people or show other people the possibilities, we have to be really willing to do that hard work on ourselves. And it's not easy, it's not fun, but it's important. Yeah.
So maybe we need a future where everyone goes to therapy and deal with this kind of thing.
I see a future in which, like, we have like a ministry of therapy where
That's it. That's the solution.
All right, we have to wrap it up, and I'm so sad because I would go on talking to you guys, and you two are so calming, talking about horrible things. I don't know how you do that. So to end very lightly and in a positive note, what would you like to see in the future for yourselves and other people?
I would like to see communities of care, systems that are based on how we can best take care of each other. When we leave it up to individuals, we leave it up to our, all the ways that stop us from doing the good thing, the right thing. That can be selfish, like, if I do this, then I have less, or if I do this, then what happens to my kids? But when we institutionalize those systems of care, then we don't leave it up to us. We have just in the same way that racism works automatically. What I would love to see is a system in which care is automatic. I don't have to. I can, because it's part of my value, but the fate of the world doesn't rest on whether I am kind, because I live in a kind system. And that's what I would love to see for the world.
Well, I think the first thing that I want is a new president for Brazil. And also, I agree with Chinelo. If people could care for each other, care for the world, care for the nature, care about other species, about everyone, and everyone has the same rights to should have a good life, should have a good way of living, should have water and food and shelter. So this would be a perfect future. And also, I want to have a lot of good books to read, good science fiction from the South, I guess. It would be very nice. So we can imagine very good futures, I guess, and can try to make them true.
That's nice. Oh, let's hope they do happen. Okay, so this is the time you get to where can people who are watching us find you, and you can self-promote if you have a new book coming out or a new course or something like that. And if you want to do therapy with Georgie, he's actually a therapist as well, other than lots of other things. So
That's awesome.
Yeah, go ahead.
For me, the thing I would want to promote is it's a project called Meteopia, and it is a collaboration between the Co-Futures and Future Fiction. The full title is Meteopia, Futures of Climate Injustice, and it will be published in both English and Italian. Basically, it is a collection of stories in which people, writers such as Dolo Tomase, Mame Diene, and Victor Fernando Ocampo talk about how the Capitalocene are affecting planetary ecosystems and the moral imperative towards climate justice. It's a beautiful collection. It's going to be published in both English and Italian. And both will be available at the end of August. For me, if you want to follow me and figure out what I'm doing and what I'm up to, I'm on Twitter at Chinelo Onwualu. It's just my name, one word. And follow me. I like to repost silly things that I see, as well as talk about the weirdness that is growing up with my 2-year-old baby. So I also like to post what some of the things I'm doing. I am working on a collection of essays by writers of color talking about what it's like to be in speculative fiction. And that is going to be out in February of 2024 through Hydra House Books. It's called Ex Marginalia.
Well, you can follow me on Instagram. I'm not using Twitter right now. Instagram is GEO_Amaral. I will write here. And next week, on Saturday, I will be in São Paulo with Ana Rush to talk about the same topic, but in person in Avenida Paulista. So everyone can see in my Instagram the specifics of it. And I have some short stories there too that you can read. And I have a novel that will be published at some time in the future. I don't know yet. But
the big one you've been writing for 10 years?
The big one, yeah.
Yay!
It's done. Yeah.
Yay!
So this is it. Can follow me there and see the news.
Oh, yay! So many impressive things. Very excited. Okay, I'll switch back to Portuguese to tell our wonderful people that are our audience what they have to do now. Muito obrigada para todo mundo que assistiu a gente. A gente está chegando no finalzinho, então você já sabe o que fazer. Se você não segue o canal ainda, por favor, segue. A gente tem um link na descrição com o nosso Pix, para a gente poder trazer mais pessoas de Libras e, quem sabe, pagar todo mundo que está trabalhando aqui, porque é muito trabalho. Vale a pena, mas ainda, né? A gente está fazendo sorteio de um monte de livro nas redes sociais, então segue a gente lá também, entre todos os sorteios. E os próximos panels, que eu não lembro mais qual é o nome das coisas, as próximas mesas vão ser hoje à tarde, para vocês do Brasil. Não lembro os horários, mas vocês entram ali no site do Relampeio, que tem tudo, ou nas redes sociais, que está tudo anunciadinho. O primeiro vai ser com o Victor Manibo, com o Eric Novello e a Anita Sarchel. sobre sexo, então vocês vão poder ouvir sobre sexo na literatura com o Victor Manibo, que eu não conheço o trabalho, mas com o Eric, que é o homem mais cheiroso da literatura brasileira, e a Anitta Satiel, que é incrível. E, por último, a gente finalmente conseguiu a Charlie Jane Anders, que vai conversar com a Hayley Cass, que é incrível, e a Kinaya. Então, não percam. E vamos trazer de volta a nossa equipe. E muito obrigada por ter assistido. Obrigada, gente. Hi.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. This was so great.
That was wonderful. Thank you so
Very
much.
Very nice. Thank you.
Chinelo,
you could keep talking for hours and people still be interested.
Yeah, right?